A thick, palpable fog slowly descended from the Manchurian hills in the early morning of June 13, 1938. In this pre-dawn silence, where every sound seemed deafening, the figure of a lone man in a dark uniform stood out unnaturally clearly. He walked confidently, but with constant glances back, as if leaving behind not just territory, but an entire universe built by his own hands. On his collar, the rhombuses of a third-rank state security commissar gleamed dully, which, in the combined arms hierarchy, was equivalent to the rank of Lieutenant General. This man was not a lost traveler, a casual smuggler, or an ordinary defector seeking a better life in a foreign land. The border was being crossed by Genrikh Lyushkov, the head of the Far Eastern Directorate of Internal Affairs, a figure of colossal influence in whose hands were concentrated the fates of millions of people and the most intimate secrets of a vast empire on its eastern borders. With each step on the damp grass, heavy with dew, he destroyed the old world, initiating a chain reaction whose echoes would reach the highest offices of world capitals. The crossing of this invisible line meant not just a change in geographical location, but a tectonic shift in the global geopolitical alignment. To comprehend the true scale and drama of this step, one must immerse oneself in the atmosphere of the late 1930s and, most importantly, trace the path of the fugitive himself, a path that led him to this point of no return. The story of Genrikh Lyushkov began long before these Manchurian fogs, in completely different settings. Hailing from the family of a simple Odessa tailor, from a young age he absorbed the spirit of radical changes that swept through the former empire. Already in the early 1920s, as a very young man, he made a choice that determined his entire future fate. He joined the state security organs. His career developed rapidly, like a coiled spring. He possessed a keen mind, phenomenal memory, absolute diligence, and a complete lack of sentimentality, qualities that the new system valued above all else. The young operative quickly bypassed regional stages, finding himself in the central apparatus in the capital. His specialization became industrial security, but Lyushkov's true talent was revealed in his ability to build complex agent networks and conduct multi-stage investigative combinations. He took an active part in the investigation of the most high-profile political cases of the early 1930s, methodically transforming from an ordinary Ispalnitl into one of the key architects of the system of total control. An important milestone in his biography was his work in the Azov Black Sea region. It was there that Lyushkov demonstrated terrifying effectiveness in implementing large-scale campaigns to cleanse society of unreliable elements. He transformed disparate, punitive actions into a smoothly operating, uninterrupted conveyor belt. By the mid-1930s, the machine of state coercion had acquired new, unprecedented forms. An era began that would forever remain in history as the time of the Great Break and subsequent large-scale purges. The mechanism of this process was striking in its bureaucratic methodicalness. Repressions ceased to be chaotic outbursts of anger. They turned into a planned economy of elimination. From the center to the regions, strict quotas, so-called limits, were sent down, which clearly specified the number of people subject to isolation or the highest measure of social protection, a euphemism that concealed the physical end of life. These limits were divided into two categories. The first category meant the immediate execution of the sentence. The second, dispatch to correctional labor camps for long terms. Genrikh Lyushkov was not just a cog in this machine, he was one of its main operators. He knew thoroughly how lists were formed, how extrajudicial bodies, known as troikas, worked, stamping out sentences with terrifying speed, often without even seeing the accused face to face. He understood the psychology of night arrests, the methods of informational and moral pressure on those under investigation, and the ways to obtain desired confessions. The system was built on an absolute presumption of guilt and demanded only one thing from its servants: the fulfillment and over-fulfillment of assigned plans. Lyushkov brilliantly coped with this task, demonstrating fanatic devotion to the cause. His successes did not go unnoticed at the very top. In the summer of 1937, he received an order that seemed to be the peak of his career. He was appointed head of the Internal Affairs Department in the Far East. The Far East in those years was a string stretched to its limit, a powder keg ready to explode from any spark. Two powerful states looked at each other through the sights. On one side were Soviet troops, on the other, the million-strong Kwantung Army of the Japanese Empire, which had occupied Manchuria and created the puppet state of Manchukuo there. Local clashes constantly flared up along the borders, sometimes escalating into real battles with the use of artillery and aviation. The region was flooded with spies, saboteurs, and smugglers. Lyushkov was given an extremely tough task: to carry out a total purge of the Far Eastern apparatus, eliminate any possible sprouts of dissent, and prepare the region for a large-scale confrontation. He had to check the loyalty of the high command of the Special Red Banner Far Eastern Army, including the legendary Marshal Vasily Blucher. With his characteristic methodicalness, the new leader set to work. In Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, a campaign of suspicion of unprecedented scale unfolded. Lyushkov arrested his predecessor, purged the ranks of his own subordinates, and conducted mass operations among the local population, including the deportation of entire ethnic groups that were considered potentially unreliable in the event of a conflict. He was endowed with unlimited powers and used them to the fullest, sending triumphant reports to the center about uncovered conspiracies and neutralized spy networks. However, while building this mechanism of fear in the territory entrusted to him, he could not fail to understand the main laws of the system's functioning. These laws were inexorable. A machine that feeds on human destinies never stops. Having sated itself with ordinary citizens, it inevitably begins to devour its own creators. In the spring of 1938, Lyushkov felt a subtle change in the atmosphere. Alarming signals began to arrive from Moscow. His closest associates from his previous work in other regions were one by one losing their posts and disappearing without a trace into the basements of central detention centers. And then, at the end of May, an urgent government telegram lay on his desk. It contained an order to immediately hand over affairs to his deputy and go to the capital. The official reason sounded reassuring: transfer to responsible work in the central apparatus and a possible promotion. To an outsider, this would have looked like a triumph and recognition of merit. But an experienced functionary, who had himself sent hundreds of people into oblivion under similar specious pretexts, read between the lines with frightening clarity. Within him, a colossal, invisible drama unfolded. It was a clash between a well-trained instinct for self-preservation and years of ingrained loyalty to ideological dogmas. He stood before an impossible choice. The first path meant submission. Boarding a salon car of the Trans-Siberian Express, arriving in Moscow, receiving an arrest warrant directly on the platform, and ending his life after long and agonizing interrogations, during which the very methods he had so assiduously perfected would be applied to him. The second path was unthinkable for a Soviet general. To commit an act that would forever inscribe his name in the lists of the greatest traitors, to erase his entire past life, to betray his motherland, his ideas, and his comrades. The instinct for survival proved stronger than any abstract ideals. Lyushkov began methodically and coldly preparing his departure. Under the pretext of his daughter's need for treatment, he sent his wife to the European part of the country, hoping she could disappear, a hope that would later prove tragically futile. Then, citing the need for a personal inspection of the border strip, he traveled to the Posyet region. On the night of June 13th, he ordered his escort to stay at a distance, stating that he had to meet a particularly important illegal agent in the neutral zone. Stepping into the fog, he left his homeland behind forever. When Japanese border patrols in the Hunchun area detained a lone man in general's uniform, they initially mistook him for a lost officer. However, the defector's very first words, uttered through a hastily summoned interpreter, made the Japanese command shudder with the realization of incredible luck. In Tokyo, they instantly understood the caliber of the figure at their disposal. The elite of the Japanese intelligence services was deployed to work with Lyushkov. Japanese intelligence, particularly the famous Tokumu Kikan Directorate, was a complex and highly effective organism. Unlike European intelligence agencies, the Japanese approach combined deep analytical calculation with elements of Eastern philosophy, focusing on agent infiltration, ideological sabotage, and the creation of fifth columns. In the Far East, they actively used emigrant circles, forming sabotage units from them, such as the infamous Asano Brigade. However, all their successes paled in comparison to the volume of information brought by the former head of the Soviet Directorate. Lyushkov did not just recount rumors or analytical reports. In his unique, trained memory was a detailed, crystal-clear picture of the entire Soviet defense from Lake Baikal to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. During multi-day, grueling debriefings in Tokyo, he handed over priceless treasures to the Japanese General Staff. He revealed the exact deployment of all military units, the number of Air Force formations, and the layouts of secret fortified areas. Moreover, he divulged lists of the Soviet agent network in Manchuria, which led to immediate failures and the liquidation of dozens of illegals. But the most terrible blow was the transfer to the Japanese of radio codes and cipher books used by the Army and Navy. Suddenly, the eastern facade of the great power, on whose strengthening colossal resources had been spent, became absolutely transparent. The news of the general's desertion created a bombshell effect in Moscow, causing a real paralysis in the upper echelons of power. The supreme leadership experienced a state close to panic. Classified reports testified to an unprecedented failure, unmatched in the history of special services. All operational plans collapsed overnight. Feverish, round-the-clock work began in the capital and the Far East. All ciphers were urgently changed, entire divisions were redeployed, fortification lines were hastily rebuilt, and agents were re-recruited or recalled. Millions of rubles and years of painstaking labor by a huge number of people were negated by one conscious decision of the fugitive. The scandal exposed the formerly unyielding hero as a venal defector who coolly exchanged state security for the illusory guarantees of his own physical salvation. This historical paradox exposes the deepest philosophical problem of totalitarian structures. When the state demands absolute, blind obedience and leaves a person no right to error, appeal, or fair trial, it provokes the most devastating betrayal with its own hands. Loyalty, which rests solely on the animal fear of inevitable reprisal, has no solid foundation. It crumbles to dust precisely at the moment when the fear of the ruthless machine becomes stronger than faith in the ideals it declares. Lyushkov was not an ideological fighter against the regime. He was not a dissident who suddenly saw the light and realized the value of human rights. He was a perfect mirror image of the system itself. His betrayal was not an act of political protest, but a mathematically precise move by a cornered, cold-blooded functionary. The state created a man devoid of moral anchors, and this man, when faced with the threat of physical elimination, used the state's own methods against it. Absolute cynicism, sober calculation, and a complete lack of sentiment. In Tokyo, the former general quickly became an incredibly valuable propaganda tool. Japanese handlers organized a series of high-profile press conferences for him, which attracted crowds of foreign journalists from all over the world. At these events, Lyushkov acted as an accuser. He spoke in detail about internal purges, the scale of repressions, the vulnerability and weakness of the Soviet military machine, and the discontent of the peasantry and the army. The Japanese government provided him with the highest level of comfort, substantial financial support, a luxurious apartment, and the semblance of deep respect. However, in the world of secret services, the status of an honored guest is always temporary. It soon changed to the role of a utilized asset. From merely leaking accumulated information, Japanese handlers decided to move to active, offensive actions. A daring, almost insane plan emerged, which, if successful, could have changed the entire course of world history overnight. Japanese military intelligence developed a plan for the physical elimination of the supreme Soviet leader. This ambitious operation was codenamed Bear. Analysts in Tokyo understood that the Soviet system was extremely centralized, and the elimination of its main figure would inevitably lead to a large-scale internal crisis, a power struggle, and, as a result, paralysis of state governance, which was extremely beneficial for Japan on the eve of a possible major conflict. Genrikh Lyushkov played a key role in the preparation of this operation. Before his appointment to the Far East, he held responsible positions in units responsible for the protection of high-ranking state officials. He knew the security system, the algorithms of the Guard's actions, the location of posts and movement routes thoroughly, down to the smallest detail. The southern resort of Matsesta in the Sochi area was chosen as the venue for the action. The choice was not accidental. The Soviet leader regularly visited this complex for therapeutic hydrogen sulfide baths. Lyushkov personally drew diagrams of the hydropathic establishment, indicated blind spots in the surveillance system, described the guard change schedule, and even the habits of the head of personal security. In Japan, a special sabotage group was formed from the most trained agents, mainly from among Russian White Guard emigrants who had undergone a rigorous school of sabotage training. The plan was to transfer the group across the weakly guarded Soviet-Turkish border. The saboteurs were to penetrate the resort area under the guise of NKVD officers, using forged documents of the highest quality, manufactured with Lyushkov's consultations. They were to take positions in the ventilation shafts and utility rooms of the hydropathic establishment, await the arrival of the motorcade, and carry out the attack at the moment when the target would be most vulnerable, during the procedures. Preparation was carried out in an atmosphere of strict secrecy. Escape routes were thought out, the latest compact weapons were purchased, and cover legends were rehearsed. However, the grandiose plan collapsed at the earliest stage of its practical implementation in early 1939. During an attempt to cross the Turkish-Soviet border, the sabotage group fell into a carefully organized ambush and was neutralized. As it turned out later, information about the impending action leaked to Moscow thanks to an extensive network of Soviet double agents embedded in émigré circles and Japanese structures in Europe and Asia. Soviet counterintelligence conducted a radio game and controlled every step of the group, even before they left the training camps. This resounding failure became a turning, fatal moment in the defector's fate. The illusions of the Japanese command regarding his omnipotence dissipated. With each subsequent year, the value of the former general rapidly declined, tending to zero. Information from 1938 was hopelessly outdated. The Soviet army in the Far East, having recovered from the shock, was completely reorganized. The command changed, new codes were introduced, fortifications were rebuilt, and tactics were changed. From an oracle predicting every move of the enemy, Lyushkov turned into an expensive, useless burden for the Japanese treasury. He tried to offer new analytical notes, wrote memoirs, but his time was inexorably running out. August 1945 arrived. The situation on the world political arena had radically and irrevocably changed. The Japanese Empire, exhausted by years of war in the Pacific, was suffering a catastrophe. Soviet troops, hardened in battles in Europe, stormed into Manchuria. Powerful tank wedges playfully ripped through the once impregnable defenses of the Kwantung Army, rapidly advancing deep into the continent. The Japanese state was on the verge of unconditional surrender. In these chaotic days, filled with the smell of burning and despair, when the foundations of ancient empires crumbled and the destinies of entire nations were being decided, the fate of an aging and lost influence traitor ceased to concern the high-ranking officials in the general staff in Tokyo. Lyushkov thrashed in a state of absolute primal panic. He understood with crystal clarity that if he fell alive into the hands of advancing Soviet vanguard units or agents of military counterintelligence SMERSH, he would face an immediate, swift trial and the harshest, most exemplary retribution. For Moscow, he remained public enemy number one. He feverishly demanded from his remaining Japanese handlers the fulfillment of previous guarantees of salvation, provision of a place on a submarine, allocation of a private plane for escape to third countries, fake passports. But for the rapidly retreating, demoralized Japanese intelligence, he suddenly became an extremely dangerous, toxic witness. During his 7 years in Tokyo and Dairen, he had learned too many intimate secrets of the Japanese military leadership itself. He knew the operational algorithms of Tokumu Kikan, the names and aliases of agents in various countries, the details of secret political operations, and clandestine backstage agreements. Handing him over alive to the advancing, victorious enemy was absolutely unthinkable. It would inflict irreparable damage to the national security of post-war Japan. And taking him with them to the Japanese islands amidst the chaos of evacuation, when there weren't enough places even for high-ranking officers of the Imperial Army, was deemed impractical. The decision regarding his fate was dictated by the same icy expediency that he himself had once followed. On August 19, 1945, Genrikh Lyushkov had his last fateful conversation with the leadership of the Japanese military mission in the Manchurian city of Dairen. Officer Yutaka Takeoka, acting on direct orders from command, suggested that the defector commit ritual suicide. This was presented as the only way to preserve the remnants of officers' honor and avoid a shameful capture. But the former Soviet functionary, raised in a completely different cultural paradigm and never understanding the lofty samurai codes of Bushido, categorically refused. He continued to demand salvation, clinging to life with the desperation of one doomed. After this brief dialogue, his path was violently and definitively cut short by Japanese officers, right in the dim light of the office. His body was secretly removed and disappeared without a trace, forever dissolving in the fire and chaos of a collapsing old world, leaving behind not even a gravestone. The story of this unprecedented defection leaves behind a complex, incredibly bitter aftertaste and many questions that continue to trouble researchers and remain chillingly relevant even decades later. We see before us a detailed anatomy of betrayal, completely devoid of any romantic aura or ideological nobility. This is by no means the story of a brave dissident who chose freedom to save an oppressed people, nor the tragedy of a thinker disillusioned with utopian ideas. This is a grim chronicle of the moral fall of a man who imagined himself a demiurge, tried to outmaneuver two ruthless, inhuman state machines, and was predictably crushed by both. The resonance of this twisted fate sounds like a loud warning about the extreme fragility of any power whose foundation is solely institutional terror. A state that cynically considers its citizens, even the most high-ranking, merely expendable material and a mechanism for achieving geopolitical goals, inevitably faces the fact that at a critical moment, these materials refuse to sacrifice themselves for the abstract ideals of the leader. The illusion of total control, built over years with the help of a repressive apparatus, is always shattered by the unpredictability of the basic human instinct for self-preservation. Loyalty, bought with fear, turns into hatred and betrayal at the first real opportunity to avoid punishment. Returning in thought to that damp, foggy Manchurian morning in June of 1938, we see not just a general in the border zone committing an act of treason. We observe a man who confidently steps into an absolute existential void. He sincerely believed that through his cunning he was exchanging an inevitable reprisal for a long and comfortable life. But in reality, he merely changed the scenery of his already predetermined, inevitable downfall. The fog, which kindly concealed his solitary figure from Soviet border guards at the moment of the fateful crossing, became a prophetic metaphor for his entire subsequent joyless fate. The irreversible loss of his own name, the forfeiture of his homeland, the complete annihilation of his officer's honor, and, ultimately, his physical disappearance without a trace. His life's end demonstrates an immutable historical pattern. A choice dictated solely by animal fear and the desire to save one's own skin at any cost never opens the doors to true freedom. It merely creates a temporary illusion of security, inexorably postponing the end and making it even more inevitable, humiliating, and inglorious. And in this grim silence of traces erased from archives, in the oblivion of an unnamed Manchurian grave, lies the most important, universal lesson of human history. No guarantees from powerful foreign governments, no offered mountains of gold, fake passports, or secret hideouts can conceal and save someone who, with their own hands, destroyed the moral foundation of their soul, transforming life into an endless, doomed flight from oneself.